Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Steven de Haas, and as the Dean of Antwerp Management School and on behalf of all our staff and partners, I would like to welcome you to this virtual roundtable on sustainable value creation. This virtual roundtable is co-organized by Antwerp Management School and the Academy of Business in Society, and with full support of our business partners, the Port of Antwerp, BASF, and Randstad. We are all very happy to have you here in this call. In the first place, we do, of course, hope that you are all healthy and safe, and we wish all of you, your family, and your organizations all the best in these strange Corona times. In the light of these strange times and crisis and its far-reaching consequences, it is great that we are joining today together on a reflection and discussion on sustainable business value and transformation in society. More than ever, this is the time to put this topic on all our agendas. It is clear that sustainable transformation entails a deep and systemic transformation of entire value chain. But such a deep transformation unlikely will happen suddenly. Many voices are calling for an urgent need on this, as for example also recently in the World Economic Forum revised manifesto in Davos for 2020. And while a sustainable transformation is underway, still challenges and resistances do remain. To address these challenges, various models have been developed by academic experts and businesses. And it is clear that understanding in a critical and thoughtful way these existing theories and concepts will be important for the further development and adoption of sustainable value creation approaches. And for that reason, and again, we are pleased to have you here and participate in this live-streamed, fully online Value Creation Roundtable. I think this roundtable is a unique moment for all of us to exchange knowledge among thought leaders and practitioners, and that we can from that moment on reconceive business value to society. With these insights, let's work together towards a stronger society for the future. I would like now to give the floor to my colleague, Professor Wayne Visser of Antwerp Management School and Ivo Master of ABIS, to also welcome you, introduce everyone in this call, and walk you through the agenda. I look forward to the discussions. Thank you. The floor is yours, Wayne.
Ivo is up next.
Thank you. Hello all, my name is Ivo Matza. I'm the CEO of ABIS, the Academy of Business in Society in Brussels. And I also thank you for the participation of this co-created event, this roundtable. We are very grateful to work together with our colleagues from Antwerp Management School. And it's quite an honor to do this, to organize this together. As Stephen already mentioned, it was we organized this roundtable, and I remember the first time that we talked about this organizing roundtable is that there should be a limited number of people because it's a round table. And the good thing in the crisis is you go digital and then suddenly you have a much larger audience. And of course there are many problems in this crisis, but I think we organize now an event with a lower footprint. We can host panelists from all over the world, and we reach more people. So I think we all are have a kind of problems in this first Corona and later economic crisis, but I think it has also a few things to learn from, that we also can do this effectively online. And I totally agree with Stephen that the sense of urgency to think in sustainable value, I think, has never been that clear as before, as today. And I remember some years ago, I think it was in 2009, that we had a project at ABIS about financial and non-financial indicators for creating value. And then the value was more or less the customer value. And I'm very happy to hear today that there are much more stakeholder or holistic views on value creation. And the fact that we are with so many people here, I think is a very good and strong signal, and that we are in this Corona crisis aware that the urgency to create sustainable value is quite high. And I think it will be good that everything is in our own hands, all of us, to accelerate this transformation and not to slow down. I hope you have a very inspiring event, and let's continue with the speech from Wayne. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ivo, and welcome everyone. I'm really pleased that you could join us, and people will be trickling in, I realize, especially in the lead up to us kicking off the first session at the top of the hour. And so what I would like to do is first briefly introduce myself. I will introduce all of the panelists at the start of the first session, which will be at the top of the hour. But before that, I thought it might be useful also to give a little reflection on what is probably a much longer journey that we've been on around the debate on value creation than most people would realize. I'm often rather amused when I get young students who come with an enthusiasm for the topic because they really discover it as something new. And of course, it's not new at all. So I'd like to start with that. Firstly, who am I? Well, I work variously as a strategy analyst, a sustainability advisor, a CSR expert, made a couple of documentaries. And I've been fortunate enough that this career, which wasn't a career when I started, became a full-time career in working on sustainable business, and has given me opportunities to work in 77 countries now. I'm currently serving as Professor of Integrated Value at Antwerp Management School, where I also hold the chair in Sustainable Transformation, which is supported by BASF, Port of Antwerp and Randstad. I'm also head tutor and fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and director of my own think tank company, Kaleidoscope Futures. And I founded CSR International a number of years ago. Before all of that, I was director of sustainability services at KPMG and strategy analyst for Capgemini in South Africa. And along the way, I've written 37 books. As we get going, I just want to tell you that if you're on social media and you want to share what you're hearing, we're using the hashtag Value Creation Roundtable. And so you're welcome to tweet and to post as we go. So what about where we've come from? I do think it's good to put this in a historical context. And when we think about the role of business in society, if you purely were to look at philanthropy, of course, you can go back thousands of years, all the way back to Hindu scripts like the Upanishads and others. I mean, this idea of being ethical, behaving properly in a market system is not new at all. And we have instances of charity and philanthropy really through our recorded history. So that idea is not new at all. If we start to look at when it became more institutionalized, of course, we can go back at least to the 1870s. If you look at figures like Carnegie or indeed Rockefeller, who really started to take all of the wealth that they'd created and share it rather generously, normally towards the end of their life. And what's interesting about that model of philanthropy as it got introduced was that we didn't question so much how those great leaders made their money, so long as they were generous with it at the end of their life. So in the case of Rockefeller, he was the richest man in the world at the time, and towards the end of his life gave away more than 95% of his wealth. The Rockefeller Foundation still exists today. But when you analyze his life, in fact, he, let's just say, had some questionable business activities. I mean, he was very aggressive in the market. At one point, he drove 23 of his 26 competitors out of business within 4 months in something called the Cleveland Massacre. He was in and out of court the whole of his life. He was involved in price fixing, collusion, cartels, you name it. So that's an interesting perspective, that this idea that yes, we can be philanthropic, but don't think about how we made our money is already one to question. Then what seemed to happen is past the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, business really started thinking. And we start to see the first instances of what we now would call corporate social responsibility appearing on the books of companies. So you get Macy's of New York already in the 1880s showing donations that they've made to an orphanage and putting that as a donation expense on their books. You get some interesting court cases emerging. So in the case of West Cork Railroads, there was a case where they had to lay off a lot of their workers, and they thought that a very responsible thing to do would be to pay them some compensation to help them get back on their feet. And the shareholders took them to court. And the reason was, they said that, you know, this is not in the ongoing interests of the company. And in fact, the court ruled in the shareholders' favor. At the same time, roughly also in the 1880s, Steinway got taken to court, the piano manufacturer, for doing something quite similar, but in this case for spending money on their current set of employees, hospitals, clinics, education facilities, and so on. And in this case, the court upheld that that was fine because it was something that could promote the productivity of the workers and therefore be in the interests of the shareholders. So that shareholder value debate has been going on much longer than we think. By the early 1900s, many companies figured out they weren't so good at charities themselves, so they started partnering with the big charities in the world. And then we really started seeing the intellectual foundations of this movement, I think, emerging. So the first books on social responsibility coming out around 1938. The first book with social responsibility in the title, Ed Bowen, in 1952, I think. And then we started seeing the intellectual leadership really emerging, and some of that is in the room today. But if we look at some of the early forerunners of that, people like Rachel Carson, who kicked off the environmental movement with her critique of the chemical industry especially, and her book Silent Spring. We get people like Ralph Nader, who was probably much more successful as an activist, taking on first General Motors and the auto industry, but then many ethical issues subsequently. More successful at that, I think, than running for US president, which he did a few times as well. And then we start to kick into people like Archie Carroll, certainly on corporate social responsibility, the academics really starting to weigh in and make sense of this. And what I think we saw was in the 1960s and 70s, especially, still a focus on shareholder value with Milton Friedman, of course. But really the issues of ethics started to creep onto the agenda. And then the agenda has built ever since. And I'm going to stop it there because I think that's enough of a long history. I expect that our panelists in the room today will give us something more of a recent history of the evolution of thinking on this. So to those who have just joined for the top of the hour, welcome. We're now kicking off the first session of our roundtable on value creation. There are around about 165 of you participating. Thank you for being here. We encourage you throughout this call to use the chat function. Hopefully you can find that and post your comments, because we are going to be inviting Jan Boehner, who's on the call here, and Carolina to feedback what you're saying on the chat. So please do make your comments. And just to make sure that the chat is working fine, before we introduce our round of panelists, I'd like you just to type in the chat, what is the city and the country that you're calling in from today? And hopefully we should see that start to stream. And as panelists as well. This will give us an idea of where people are from, quite a lot from Belgium, but I saw Japan flash by, certainly some from Germany, from the US, from South Africa, India, Buenos Aires, that's good, Lebanon, Switzerland, Italy. So wonderful. Please keep using the chat as we go. We have a diverse audience, and your main way to interact with us today is via the chat. So let me first then introduce who we have with us today on the panel. In the order in which we are going to have them speak, we have Professor Robert Phillips. You can wave when I introduce you, who's the George R. Gardiner Professor in Business Ethics at Schulich School of Business, and he will be talking about stakeholder value. And I will be introducing each of you in a bit more detail just before you speak. We have Professor Jed Emerson, founder of Blended Value Group and an independent strategic advisor to impact investors. Welcome, Jed. He will be talking about blended value. We have Professor Stuart Hart, who's the Stephen Grossman Distinguished Fellow in Sustainable Innovation at the University of Vermont Grossman School of Business. And Stuart will be talking about sustainable value. We have Mark Kramer, co-founder and managing director of FSG and a faculty member at Harvard Business School, who will be talking about shared value. And I'll be saying a little bit about integrated value as well. So just before I introduce Robert Phillips in a little bit more detail, I'd like to launch a poll and ask you, to what extent do you believe that companies have moved beyond the shareholder value model of business? So if that's working correctly, you should have the poll having popped up. And so I'll just give you a few minutes to vote on that while I introduce our first panelist in a little bit more detail, and that is Robert Phillips. So once again, welcome, Robert. As I said, you're the George Gardiner Professor in Business Ethics and a Professor of Strategic Management at the York University's Schulich School of Business. You're the author of Stakeholder Theory and Organizational Ethics. Your other research interests include stakeholder theory, the history of corporate responsibility, ethics and networks. And you're affiliated with the Center of Excellence in Responsible Business at Schulich and a senior fellow at the Olson Center for Applied Ethics at the Darden School, and a past president of the Society for Business Ethics. You're also consulting editor at the Journal of Business Ethics. So welcome. I'm going to end the poll there and we'll share the results. And so it does look like only somewhat, a little, or not at all. So very few people, roughly 11%, think that we have moved beyond the shareholder value model for business. So that's probably a good way to cue you up. So tell us, Robert, stakeholder value, where does the concept come from? What does it mean? And how did you get involved with it?
Yeah, so thank you, Wayne, for having me. I assume everyone can hear me all right? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for organizing and arranging this, and hello to everyone out there. I was told that perhaps I was first because stakeholder theory was the older, wait a minute, clear this off, was one of the older of the theories offered here today. And I did have the great pleasure of working with and co-authoring with Ed Freeman, who I suppose is taken by most to be the godfather of stakeholder theory, though he cringes each time we say this. But the most highly cited journal article is where I want to start off today. This is Donaldson and Preston and their famous three-part trichotomy of instrumental, descriptive, and normative stakeholder theory. So descriptive is just merely describing more or less scientifically how managers treat stakeholders. Instrumental is treating stakeholders in a particular way with a given end, typically something like either profit or shareholder wealth maximization. in mind, and then normative stakeholder theory explicitly involves and engages with ideas from moral theory and ethics. Interestingly, it's often taken as a tripartite distinction, even though it is, in fact, there's 4 bits, and it's often under-examined what it means when Donaldson and Preston take the 4th leg of their table to be that stakeholder theory is managerial. And it's always been remarkable to me that we haven't unpacked that more. I've done a little bit of thinking about it. But part of what it must mean is that stakeholder theory is less emphasizing of things like philanthropy, of things like the macroeconomic political economy policy. Of course, these things impact on how we manage our stakeholder relationships, but it's not the core interest of a managerial stakeholder theory. I bring this up because even though as a non-epidemiologist, I have very little to say about when we're going to open up the rest of the world and this sort of thing. I trust the experts for that. What I do know is that there are stakeholder decisions being made all around the world right now by managers, and these are very difficult decisions that they are making. It's often been said that shareholder wealth maximization and stakeholder theory more or less look like the same thing. If you're managing your stakeholder relationships for these instrumental shareholder wealth maximization purposes, very often you're just going to have to treat people well for these instrumental reasons. With that said, there are times when these theories do in fact diverge, and I think that moments like this crisis are precisely the acid test that we would be looking for to see which one was really going on behind the curtains between shareholder or profit maximization or true authentic stakeholder relationship optimization. So another concern that many have with stakeholder theory is that it doesn't give a single objective function, and that we often have to make trade-offs, and that stakeholder theory is unable to tell us exactly as managers how to make these trade-offs. One thing that stakeholder theory emphasizes, particularly recently, is that skipping to trade-offs too early is a default practice. It's mildly hackish, right? And that what a strong stakeholder manager will do all along is look for ways to align the values among their stakeholders. And this often involves having creative third-way solutions rather than skip straight to trade-offs. Now, I don't want to imply by this that trade-offs are never necessary, because of course that is not true. At some point we do occasionally have to make decisions that damage some people's well-being. The main point I'm trying to make here is that skipping to those trade-offs too quickly as a default, because we think we know what our objective function, because we think that those just are our values. So right now we're seeing some of this creativity around the world, and I think that we will be hearing more and more about how less than General Motors sized businesses have adapted to this scenario. But of course, we see automakers trying to figure out how to make ventilators. We see whiskey distillers figuring out how to make hand sanitizer. And these are obviously creative solutions that will keep some people on board. More recently, I've been hearing, instead of laying off large parts of the workforce, I've been hearing increasing examples of take 1 week per quarter off, or maybe 1 day every week or every 2 weeks. And in a way that sort of spreads the pain around a little bit more evenly, I suppose, rather than laying off. And for those of you, just in case there are other scholars or academics out in the audience, I have seen the future. The University of Arizona is reducing faculty salaries by between 17 and 20%. So lest we think that the ivory tower is safe from some of this pain sharing, it will be interesting to see. Now, of course, in the same way that we see donations from Jeff Bezos, $100 million, and we want to compare that to his total wealth, of course, to see if he has shared enough of our pain. It is noteworthy that University of Arizona's endowment is about $1 billion. And so I can imagine, why do we have endowments? Why do we have rainy day funds? It doesn't get much rainier than this, but that's a bit of a digression.
I'm going to come in here, Robert, if you don't mind, because I wanted to just kind of, we're dealing with the crisis, of course, which is on everybody's mind. I'm just wondering, with a bigger picture shift, which we seem to get signaled just before the crisis with a business roundtable statement signed by 181 CEOs of the biggest companies. I mean, that was basically a declaration to say we recognize that we operate for stakeholders and not only for shareholders. It only came, you know, whatever it was, 25 years late after 1984 when Ed Freeman introduced the concept. So I just wonder how seriously you take that statement. Is that a real shift, or is that just a little bit of convenient marketing?
I'm reasonably confident. So we've done a piece for the Journal of Management reflecting on those principles. I'm not 100% sure if it's out yet, but it did give us a moment to think about this. And the truth is, on the one hand, there was always a diversity of leadership among those leaders. And so I suspect that some of them are just reasserting what they were already doing. For some of them, it is window dressing. Perhaps to me, one of the more interesting points about that document is that it rings the death knell of shareholder wealth maximization as a legal requirement. Unless you assume that all of these CEOs put their names on something like this without running it through their corporate attorneys, then assuming that they did, I have to assume that legal got at least a brief look at this. That the idea that you have a legal obligation to maximize shareholder wealth died that day, unless you don't believe the entire legal team of 180 of the largest corporations in the world.
Right.
So that's my sort of brief reflection. There's, of course, more to say about that as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll bring you back into the discussion, of course, when we open it out, but I'd like to go to Jed now, Jed Emerson, because everything to do with capital and money is certainly no stranger to you. So let me begin with an introduction. So Jed Emerson spent the past 4 decades exploring diverse aspects of value creation and positive impact via corporations, social enterprises, and capital markets. And presently is a strategic advisor to leading impact investor family offices and investment firms. He's held faculty appointments at Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford business schools. In the late 1990s, he led the first team to formalize a methodology to track social return on investment, and he introduced the concept of blended value in 2000. And Jed, your latest work focuses on exploring the history, purpose, and future of capital. So shareholder value is all about capital. How is blended value different, and where did it come from?
I think they're both the same in the sense that all of this whole conversation, as you so nicely teed up, has a historical background to it. And I think as a part of that, we need to recognize that all of these ideas are grounded in social and cultural constructs for how people at different periods of time have understood the nature of value. And I think that we tend to, again, speaking of our own ignorance, because we don't know this often, we enter the conversation either professionally or in the course of one's life, very excited about discovering ideas that actually are fundamental to the human experience. And I think when we talk about value, that's really at core what we're talking about, is how different cultures and communities, different generations have understood the nature of the value that they seek to create over the course of a life. I'll make 2 observations up front. So therefore, the fact that on this panel, we're not benefiting from our female colleagues, we're not benefiting from indigenous perspectives, we're not benefiting from perspectives from the global South, I think will have an effect on how we understand the nature of value. And so we need to call that out, I think, right up front as really a limitation for the lens that we bring to this conversation. In my case, I started my career in social work, and we were very clear that we were the good guys and the business community was the bad guys. And the dominant practice really was, especially at that time, what you described in terms of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and those who came after them in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, where the practice really was what could be thought of as rape, pillage, and philanthropy, where there was a disconnect between how you made your money and what you then went to do with that money. And I came into the conversation and into this community in the 90s, where I, for 11 years, ran a fund with George Roberts, who's one of the founding partners of KKR, where we were taking philanthropic capital and investing it in market-facing companies that were owned by nonprofits seeking to employ formerly homeless people. And so we were right in the middle of this tension between, quote, do well and do good. And I think that there was a generation of us who came up during that period, the folks who were involved in the US, and there was a version of this going on in Europe at the same time. But in the US, the practices were driven out of communities of people like Social Venture Network and Investor Circle, and basically what you could think of as kind of mission-motivated entrepreneurs and investors. And across from them were venture philanthropists and strategic philanthropists, nonprofit social entrepreneurs. And what happened, I think, was toward the end of the 90s, you saw this coming together, where a group of folks recognized that they were all talking about what, to my mind, was fundamentally the same thing, which is a vision of value that is whole and integrated. And yet each of us in our own silos was struggling with the limitations of a bifurcated value proposition that asked you to either make a grant or make an investment. It asked you to either work in a nonprofit or a for-profit. It said that the organizational structures and the leadership approaches really should be different because the motivations were thought to be different. And yet all of us were struggling with the limitations of a bifurcated value proposition. And so in the late 90s, I began to say that instead of focusing on the investment vehicle or delivery mechanism, instead of thinking in terms of a grant or an investment, a nonprofit or a for-profit, what we needed to do is step back and revision our understanding of the value that we sought to create in the world, and then look at what were the best mechanisms, tools, and techniques that we could use and mobilize in order to advance that value. And to my mind, value is fundamentally whole and non-divisible. It has component parts of economic, social, and environmental elements, the triple bottom line, if you will, but that triple bottom line needs to be viewed as fully whole and integral. And that in the absence of that, you end up with this set of trade-offs that actually limit your ability to optimize and capture the value you seek in the world.
So Jed, if I could ask you then, firstly, I think you've given us the explanation, but in a one sentence, what is blended value? But more interesting in a way, you've had quite an impact through social return on investment as almost an approach or a method, and also getting into the whole area of impact investing. So is impact investing, all it's cracked up to be? Is it having a big impact? Is it still marginal? Maybe you could just say a few words on that.
Well, at its best, impact investing is in essence the capitalization of blended value. And the organizations, the companies, whether nonprofit or for-profit, that capital moves into are, again, I think, pursuing blended value, whether or not people use these terms. This is how I understand, what's happening in the world, if you will. When we get into the conversation around impact investing, to my mind, we talk about total portfolio management. I work with ultra high net worth families, and when we develop capital allocation and deployment strategies, we are looking at all of their assets. We're looking at philanthropic, near market, and market rate capital, and saying across that continuum, what is the risk, return, and impact profile of any given investment vehicle or strategy, and then reflect on that from the asset owner's perspective with regard to the nature of the value that that family seeks to create in the world. And I would argue that some variation of that, for better or worse, is at play for all fiduciaries, whether institutional or family office or what have you, and that this is the social conversation that we're engaged in, is that we know now that if we simply do traditional financial analysis, we will miss many things that could be viewed as, quote, off balance sheet. So for example, for years, petroleum companies were highly valued because of the amount of oil that they had in the ground. In a world where that oil is actually destroying culture and community and environment, those assets become stranded and actually are off balance sheet risks. And so it's a different way of understanding the nature of the value that we seek to create and the resources we have to do so.
All right, thanks, Jed. And I'll just note to the other panelists that some questions are coming in on the chat, so keep an eye on that. You'll have a chance to come back and give your answer on some of those. But now I'd like to move to Stuart Hart and to introduce Stuart. He's a professor and Stephen Grossman Distinguished Fellow in Sustainable Business at the University of Vermont's Grossman School of Business and co-founder of the school's Sustainable Innovation MBA program. Bloomberg Businessweek has described him as one of the founding fathers of the base of the pyramid economic theory. He's also the founder of Enterprise for a Sustainable World and the BOP Global Network. His over 100 articles and 9 books have received more than 40,000 Google Scholar citations, and his best-selling book, Capitalism at the Crossroads, is among Cambridge University's top 50 books on sustainability of all time. So welcome, Stuart. I mean, your concept of sustainable value, where did that come from? We mentioned in the introduction there, BOP, bottom of the pyramid, which came just before it. So I guess it also built on that work that you did with C.K. Prahalad. So where did it come from? What is it?
Yeah, well, Wayne, thank you. And good to be with everyone. Yeah, for me, the thinking on this kind of emerged starting in the mid-90s, but it actually kind of goes back further than that, you know, to more like 35 years ago. I joined the faculty at the University of Michigan in the business school in 1985. And, you know, now with the benefit of retrospect, can see what was happening at the time, which was the ideological takeover of business schools by the shareholder value methodology and perspective. And so I was a young, wet behind the ears strategy professor. I watched that happen. Was teaching strategy. Increasingly, the strategy courses were steered in that direction. Because my background in the 70s was, you know, I'm a master's degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, teaching strategy in business schools. So I kept trying to bring this perspective in without too much success. And it was only in the 90s that windows began to open. So it started with the recognition that shareholder value, you know, is more than just driving, you know, kind of earnings per share and quarterly earnings. It's more multidimensional. We know that from the balanced scorecard. Wayne, if you bring up that slide, you know, so it started realizing, you know, as you think more deeply about it, that that shareholder value is actually a multidimensional concept, right? That it requires you to do more than just drop short-term earnings to the bottom line. You know, that there's an internal aspect of building capabilities in order to, you know, kind of drop value to the bottom line. That's the lower left quadrant. But then you also have to think about other dimensions. You have to think about not only about managing today's business effectively, but also how you grow tomorrow's business at the same time. You have to think about internal competencies, but you also have to think about external perspectives, and often those things can be in conflict. So I realized, you know, as sort of the 90s emerged, that there was not only was the idea of shareholder value a multidimensional construct, but as more and more perspectives came forward about what we'll call sustainability, because in the early 90s that was not yet a well-known buzzword in the business world. That there were all of these different perspectives, right? That sustainability is tribal, right? That people are preaching different elements and different dimensions and different constructs of sustainability. So my motivation then, starting in the mid-90s, was to, you know, can I figure out how these various elements that are emerging about sustainability in business, how might those relate constructively to the generation and drive of shareholder value in all of its dimensions? So you put up this first lower left quadrant, which I think was the one that emerged first, in the late 80s and 90s around pollution prevention. It should be obvious why that happened, because it was what produced the quickest short-term returns. So that got traction very quickly beginning in the early 90s. That, from a corporate payoff shareholder value point of view, it's about cost and risk reduction in today's business. And pollution prevention, at least in some cases, delivered that, right, in terms of minimizing waste and emissions from operations. So that took off, right, that as one construct, as one tribal group around continuous improvement, around eco-efficiency, and of course, we may be reaching the limits of that, right, in terms of diminishing returns. But I think that's been a prominent strategy for some time. But then next, I think what really emerged was what I'll call product stewardship, which was more than just minimizing waste and operating efficiently in company facilities. It really kind of reached out, and you think about the entire value chain, upstream to all the way to where raw materials come from, downstream, product and use, end of life, and all of the stakeholders that are engaged in that. So I think here there's a strong connection with the idea of stakeholder theory and how to integrate those stakeholder views, but then to also realize that there are important implications for life cycle thinking, for product design, for green supply chains, for design for environment, for product take back, right? That product stewardship, is a kind of a distinctive strategy unto itself. And if done well, can really help drive reputation, legitimacy, differentiation, and so forth. So for that reason, under the right set of circumstances, it can be a value driver, right? But on different dimensions than pollution prevention, right? It's a different strategy. But then, it became pretty clear that just sort of driving value in today's business isn't nearly enough, right? If as a company, your objective is to be in business for the long term, you have to be constantly growing tomorrow's capabilities, tomorrow's businesses. It's not, first perform today and then worry about tomorrow. These have to be done simultaneously. So it became clear this idea of clean technology is really about growing tomorrow's competence for creating tomorrow's businesses. It's about radical innovation. It's about building new competencies. And the payoff there has to do with innovation and repositioning for the future. That if you just kind of milk today's competencies, you eventually fly that plane into the ground. And so clean tech, a distinctive strategy with a very different shareholder value logic than pollution prevention or product stewardship. And then lastly, if you think more externally, because often companies can be R&D intensive, can be great, kind of generators of technology, but are never able to really match that with market creation or market opportunity. It became increasingly clear that this idea, we'll call it new market space. This is where the work on base of the pyramid really came from, that you have unmet needs, underserved markets, and that equally important to product stewardship, which has to do with thinking about the entire life cycle in current products. There's an opportunity space around new market creation where you co-create new business models for those unmet needs, right? That has to do with disruption, with new business models, with building new collaborative ecosystems in order to serve those unmet needs. And the payoff there has more to do with growth and future trajectory in terms of driving shareholder value, because that's important too. So this is where the idea of this framework came from, that it's a portfolio really, and that every corporation, especially public corporations, have a portfolio. In other words, you can see their level of effort on those different sort of four constructs of sustainability strategy. And the question is, what's the right portfolio?
Yeah. And Stuart, you often talk about this being something like a great leap forward. Just explain to us what you mean by that and why you characterize it that way.
I talked about the green leap,
Yeah.
The green leap. And there the idea was, after having kind of worked with a variety of companies, over the years, kind of applying this framework, what became evident, and I think it's still true, tragically, although this is changing, is that most incumbent firms are bottom heavy on that framework, right? In other words, they're pretty strongly engaged with pollution prevention and increasingly with product stewardship, but tend to have only minimal investments around creating tomorrow's competencies, in terms of inherently clean and regenerative technology, or kind of opening up and creating tomorrow's markets, especially in the underserved space, so that the typical portfolio is bottom heavy. And it seemed to me, now going back 20 years, that the future lies, in figuring out how, it's not that you give up or abandon the bottom part of the matrix, you can't if you're an incumbent firm, but it seemed to me that there was a driving need for more investment in the top part of that matrix, and that's what I thought about as the green leap.
Great, thanks, Stuart. We'll bring you back in as we go into the general discussion. I'd like to bring in Mark Kramer now, who's a leading researcher, writer, speaker, and consultant on strategies for social impact, including moving beyond ESG towards impact investment and systems change. Mark, you're best known as co-author of the seminal articles on creating shared value with Michael Porter in Harvard Business Review and Collective Impact with John Kenia in Stanford Social Innovation Review. You founded FSG with Professor Michael Porter and served as managing director for this 150-person global social impact consulting firm, which also supports the Shared Value Initiative, among other networks. And you're a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School. So tell us a little bit of where this has come from. Shared value, you've obviously, did we lose? We seem to have, yes, no, we're fine. So Mark, shared value, you worked with Michael Porter on this. How do you describe it? What is it? How is it the same or different to other things that we've been sharing? And yeah.
Thank you, Wayne, and good day, everyone. And it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here with Robert and Jed and Stuart, who to whom we owe a great debt. We're rather latecomers to the game. I started working with Michael Porter, gosh, close to 30 years ago, really in the area of philanthropy. Both of us had been involved in charitable foundations and nonprofits, and we began to think about how do you make philanthropy more effective? What does strategy mean in philanthropy, where philanthropists don't compete with each other, they're trying to accomplish similar goals. And that led to a body of work that led us to start FSG, which originally stood for Foundation Strategy Group. Along the way, we had some companies come to us. Actually, Shell was the first company that came to us to help them think about a strategy for their foundation. And we very quickly realized that the company has so much more impact on social and environmental issues than their foundation ever could have. And we began to think about the role of business and society from that perspective. And then we began to bring in Porter's strategy frameworks. And I think something that we didn't do a very good job of articulating in that first shared value article is how much shared value comes out of Porter's frameworks. So we saw that Porter's famous 5 forces that helps you understand profitability in industry, the 5 forces really are affected by social and environmental issues. If you look at a 5 forces analysis of electric power utilities or food and beverage companies, you see that changing social and environmental conditions have a huge impact on where competitive opportunity lies. And so this idea of creating shared value we talked about as having 3 different levels. The first, which is very much consistent with what Stuart was talking about in terms of thinking about tomorrow, and external forces, is around finding new opportunities, new products, new markets. And of course, in Porter's framework, it very much comes out of the idea of competitive positioning and differentiation. The second level is around increasing productivity in the value chain. And again, as we've looked at Porter's value chain frameworks, we see that every single step in the value chain both depends on certain external conditions, environmental and social conditions, and also has an effect on social and environmental conditions. And the third level is really about strengthening the cluster or the environment, competitive context in which a company is operating. And in each of these areas, we've seen that companies can be a very, very powerful actor in delivering positive social and environmental benefits. And they can do it in ways that reinforce their competitive positioning. So one quick example, when I teach a course now on creating shared value at the business school, we often start with Discovery Insurance, which is a health and life insurance company from South Africa. And they've developed a very sophisticated set of incentives that lead their clients to actually engage in healthier behavior. They exercise more, they eat better, and as a result, they have about 15% lower healthcare costs. They have about a 10-year longer life expectancy. We've had studies from Johns Hopkins and others confirming this effect. And it's really rethinking the nature of insurance from saying it's merely about spreading risk to saying, wait a minute, insurance companies can actually create incentive models that change risk, that reduce risk, and therefore create a more profitable model. And so what we've seen in many different industries is that the industry was developed and competitive positions were taken at a time when people thought social and environmental impacts didn't matter, weren't relevant. But today they are relevant. And companies like Coca-Cola or Duke Energy or others have a challenge. They have to either rethink their business model based on what we know today about the environment, about nutrition, et cetera, and find a new competitive positioning. Or in many cases, they're just trying to hold off change by lobbying against regulation and trying to persuade consumers that these things aren't real. And of course, that's a losing battle. So the way we think of creating shared value is really about a competitive strategy that takes into account social and environmental impacts as a source of differentiation, greater profitability.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I'm glad you brought in environmental at the last minute as well, because one of the perceptions could be that shared value is only talking about social and economic win-wins. Do you also see in the model that there is an acknowledgement that it's not always a win-win, that actually there can be destruction of value as well, or in fact there can be trade-offs? So yes, we create this shared value on this part of our business, but actually in the meantime we're destroying a different kind of value in another part.
Yes, and first of all, I should say that we got a little tired of repeating social and environmental every time we talked about an impact. And we've tried to just talk about social impacts, but we certainly mean to include environmental impacts in that. Environmental impacts do have social consequences. So we were never trying to avoid environmental impact. Shared value is very much about win-win. We're always careful to say, it's not the same as corporate social responsibility. Companies still do have an obligation to minimize and mitigate the negative externalities that they create. That's not always a win-win. It is sometimes a question of regulation and sometimes a question of prudence. And so we do think of shared value as being mostly win-win situations. In my experience, the win-lose situations are often trying to retrofit business models to take into account environmental or social obligations and regulations without really rethinking the business model. And shared value, ideally, is about rethinking the business model to find profitable opportunities based on what we know today about the importance of social and environmental impact. So you can well imagine an insurance company that has a win-lose proposition around trying to minimize healthcare costs and therefore putting their consumers in a worse health situation. But when you really rethink the model as Discovery did, you find there are opportunities for win-win strategic positioning.
All right, thank you. Some interesting questions coming on the chat, which we'll return to, among others, what's the link of all of this to the SDGs? And we'll return to that as I open it out. Before we do that, I just want to introduce the way that I've been framing these issues for the last couple of years. My main interest is systems thinking, and are we making sure that we apply a systemic approach to our thinking about value? So I'm just going to share my screen again. and just briefly share the model that I use. It certainly builds on all the models that have come before. But the way that I try to explain, in fact, even sustainable development, is that it's all about looking at these very interconnected systems, the economic, social, ecological, knowledge, and human system, but especially looking at where things are systemically breaking down. And I call that disruption, which is about the shocks to the system. We're busy going through one now in the form of a pandemic. Disparity, which is a lot of the social issues around discrimination and inequality. The degradation, which is the environmental piece. Disconnection, which has two faces. One, of course, there is a digital divide, which exacerbates inequality. Not everyone has access to the technology. But on the other hand, some super connected societies now are starting to see a different kind of disconnection where the machines are replacing us. And so we get disconnected again. And then discontent, which is about the lack of health and well-being. And for each of these areas, there is a kind of area of the economy that is responding. And to me, this is the work of sustainability or social responsibility or value creation. And you get a resilience economy, which is dealing with that risk piece and ensuring that we can survive and thrive through times like these. The access economy, making sure that the economy itself is more inclusive, building on concepts like bottom of the pyramid models and so on. The circular economy, getting to zero waste. Digital economy, fourth industrial revolution, Internet of Things, and so on. And the well-being economy. And each of these creates a pathway to innovation. And to me, integrated value is just the term that I use, is when you can do more than one of these things at a time. So again, in a way with a win-win perspective, can you create a smart solution using technology that is also sustainable, or a shared solution that is also satisfying? And you'll see that kind of thinking, I think, reflected in all of the models that have been shared by all of you on the panel today, to try and get to that synergy, that point of multiplying the benefits. But at the same time, we can use it as a kind of a test list, if you like, to say, well, if we're creating value that makes us more secure here, but at the same time we're destroying the planet, then that's probably an unacceptable trade-off, or at the very least we need to have a conversation about those trade-offs. So just throwing that into the discussion. Now I'd like to open it out a bit and first just give an opportunity to any of the panelists to respond to what you've heard, and also what's been posted on the chat. And Jed's quickest on the draw, so we'll start with you, Jed.
Well, first off, I loved all the comments. This was really interesting. And the question I have for all of us is, what are are there true limits? And if we think about a systems frame, where do you draw, quote, boundaries? I can see, quote, win-win scenarios. I can see kind of stakeholder interest activities where for a small set of actors, you're win-win, but if you expand your definition of the boundary, it's still not addressing true systems change. It's still not addressing fundamental inequities in the world. And it's still not truly, quote, sustainable. And so I'm curious to hear people's perspective on kind of like, is any of this really ultimately good enough? I mean, when we look at coronavirus and how it just kind of blew through boundaries and also lifted up the real disparities in race and class, at least in the United States, I wonder if this is, any of this, when push comes to shove, is good enough for what needs to happen.
Great question. Thanks, Jed. Of course, everything's a nested system, right? So you can create value at one part of the system and destroy at another part. Stu.
Yeah, Jed, I think that's really a key question, right? And it strikes me, as I sort of sit here now, quarantined, that in some ways this, like, I suppose we could call it a movement over the last, 30 years or so, was a response to the emergence and domination of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, right? That really happened in starting in the late 70s and into the 80s. As I referred to at the start of my comments. And, you know, so I think for the last 30, 40 years, it's been, at least from an American perspective, right? I mean, it's different in other parts of the world. The expectation that government was going to take a leadership role just was an illusion, right? And so I really think that what's going on now, you know, with COVID-19 just blows all that apart, right? And I don't think it's going to come back together. We're not going to go back to the way it was. I think in many ways, this is, even though it's horrible, a really opportune time, because we're going to desperately need you know, an engaged, positive, proactive government in order for any of this to really work, right? Now, so I think you're right. I mean, there's no way that just individual company actions were ever going to be sufficient. And so it's high time now that we blend that with, you know, kind of forward-leaning government as well, in order to create a system that has a chance of being sustainable long term.
I would just echo that. I think you can't have a just and sustainable society without good government. And good government is unfortunately an extremely rare commodity, not just in the US, but in the world. And companies can do a lot, but they can't do enough without government behind it. I completely agree. You know, I'll also say we found that there are shared value opportunities in sort of unexpected places where we wouldn't first have expected. So we did a report on the competitive advantage of racial equity in the United States, looking at how companies that have typically ignored populations of color and not designed either their employment circumstances or their products and services to meet the needs of those populations, are actually missing tremendous economic opportunity by not doing so, and found interesting examples where companies have improved the productivity, reduced turnover costs dramatically by shifting to much greater sensitivity, racial sensitivity and equity in their employment practices.
Thank you.
And I suppose that mine is a plea for humility, I guess. I want to have some success in what I strive to do, and I think that while business is able to expand its responsibilities, as we've been seeing in some organizations, it's almost too much to ask for a lot of companies. Not all, you know, if you're in the Fortune 100 and you have balance sheets the size of GDPs, then perhaps what you're describing is a more viable opportunity. But for the vast run of businesses, if we can do our shop more ethically and more sustainably and more equitably, that's a good day's work to me.
Okay, I'm going to invite Jan to come in and just share a little bit of what's been going on the chat. Any themes that you see coming out there, or questions you think were particularly interesting?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Some questions are already raised and also answered by the panelists. We have approximately 3 themes and topics that came across also in the preparation and the questions that the registrations came through. One is about the future of value creation, and also that we hear and read that our companies trying to evolve from a do no harm towards a do better aspect. We live with a lot of challenges reflected in the SDGs. So what are the best ways to make trade-offs, to prioritize, to link towards those SDGs? That's one. The second is more on barriers and opportunities to implement the value creation concepts that we talked about. One specific question was also on how do you see the impact of government administration, such as the Trump's administration, to roll out the respectable initiatives that companies take worldwide? Is the solution for everything a responsible and purpose-driven leadership? And then more reflected towards small and medium-sized companies, how are they dealing with that? Because how can they become from a short-term perspective to a longer-term perspective? And then the last broader topic is about the alignment between the concepts. So when you talked about the integrated value approach, but how can the concept get more aligned? Mark already responded to a question, do we need both CSV and CSR? Is CSV supersede CSR? And how to align or combine concepts that we talked about. So these are the 3 overall themes that we see here.
Thanks, Jan. Good comments and questions. Certainly, I'm for saying we're not looking for a super unified theory of everything, and that whichever concepts and models work in a particular context, if they're useful, they should be used. There is certainly overlap in this, but I think also each comes from a different angle. And I just wanted to, in a way, come back to what Jed raised, which is, how do we know when value creation or destruction is crossing a threshold? Are we really going to rely on governments to say this much and no more? That seems to have been our assumption in capitalism until now, that governments will tell us when we've exceeded the boundaries, but we know that that's been completely abused, and the bigger companies get, the more they're able to abuse it. Whereas now we have a movement of science-based targets and so on. A lot of the value creation approaches we're talking about are still just putting the power to define value and the limits of value in the hands of companies, and to say, well, yes, we've created this much value by doing this and that, but aren't there certain thresholds beyond which it's no longer acceptable? If you look at value to society as a measure, you can show financially, this is how much economic value we've created, how much social value we've created, and oh, by the way, we're destroying environmental value, but the value we're creating for the economy and society is much bigger, so maybe we shouldn't be worried about ecological value destruction. And of course, that's a total misunderstanding of systems theory. So I'm just interested to get the panelists' views on any of those themes that were raised, or indeed, how do we get to something where we start to have this as a little bit more of a sharper tool rather than a way just to claim value creation. Anybody want to kick off on that?
Well, I can say, I think we are all talking about very similar, overlapping, and nearly identical things in many ways, with slight differences. But the big issue, I find, is whether business leaders, and for that matter, business school students, understand that social and environmental issues are a part of the business equation and not something that is on the side or that is a cost to be minimized or avoided. And there is this mindset shift that I think is the most fundamental one, to really recognize, and coronavirus is a extraordinary example. You can't have successful businesses in a failing economy where there is disease, where there is environmental harm, where there is social harm. And you can't have a healthy society without competitive, profitable businesses that generate wages and taxes and philanthropy and everything else. And so it's really, but we come out of a time where people really believed that the two were antagonistic, that if you were doing something good in the world, you couldn't be serious about making money. And if you were serious about making money, you couldn't pay attention to whether the consequences were good or bad. And that is no longer a reality, but there are an awful lot of people who still have that mindset. And
Right.
To me, the fundamental shift to make the systemic change you're talking about, Wayne, is this shift in mindset.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I can see that we have things to say, but we're going to have to say them briefly. So I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance just to give a concluding response or thought. And we'll go in the order, I think, in which the hands came up. So Robert Phillips first, and then Stu.
I don't have so much by way of concluding remarks as a question, so you have to sort of take your shot when it's when you're open. So Mark, you mentioned that you feel as though Porter's 5 forces really was the grounding for this, and something I've always wondered. It strikes me that the original 5 forces are remarkably competitive with regard to stakeholders. It always felt to me a little zero sum. I'm sure you've had some occasion to think about the relationship between competition and cooperation among stakeholders with respect to CSV. So again, I don't want to absorb your concluding remarks time as well as my own, but if you had a moment or two on that, I must confess curiosity.
We'll come back to that in a moment, Mark. Let's go to Stu.
Yeah, also not so much a concluding comment as just some thoughts. A number of the participants have raised the question about the SDGs. And it strikes me that the SDGs, I think, are extremely useful, but can also be because of the volume, you know, there's 17 big goals and 100 and some odd sub goals and targets, can be a little daunting, you know, for people and companies. And so I think maybe the one caveat is it's easy for companies to kind of treat the SDGs in a form of neo-compliance way, you know, where, you know, you delegate, all right, so go figure out which of these we're hitting on, you know, and then we can say we're addressing goal 3, 5, and 7, put that in our sustainability report and we're done. So I think there's a real danger there that it ends up being just a form of neo-compliance. But I think there are companies that have been able to kind of grab a hold of the SDGs and really internalize them in such a way that, you know, if you really, I mean, it's kind of long to read them all, but if you're able to kind of really absorb what's in the SDGs and then incorporate that into a process of creative thinking about how companies can either leverage their current competencies or use it as a focus for growing new ones, the SDGs can be a real source of creative thinking about how to create sustainable value. That I think is the highest and best use.
Great, thanks, Stu. We will come to Jed next for a concluding comment, and then we'll end with Mark.
Well, I would just like to kind of pick up on both Robert and Mark's comments. Robert, in regard to humility, Mark, in terms of mind shift. I think one of the big opportunities that we all have is to really step back ourselves personally and reflect in a different way about the limitations that we bring to our own practice. I think that there are so many embedded biases, cultural orientations that inhibit us from actually redefining the role and place of companies as well as capital. My last book, The Purpose of Capital, which I am promoting because it's free at purposeofcapital.org. You can get a digital version. Really says, look, I did 7 books on the tactics and the strategies, and ultimately realized that what's, quote, wrong with this conversation is that all of that is about the how, and each of us individually must re-engage in a much deeper way with the why. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to understand which tool, tactic, and approach works for who we are and how we understand the world, and that we have this great opportunity to reinvent not just the world, but ourselves in the process of that pursuit. And so I would encourage us each to go deeper in ourselves and not settle for the easy answers.
Great, thanks. And Luke on chat saying maybe it's a heart shift more than a mind shift. So final word, 60 seconds for you, Mark.
Well, I'll just quickly respond to Robert's comment. I think that the 5 forces is very zero-sum in the sense that all of the different players in an industry are trying to capture as much of the value as possible, and they take it away from others. But what Porter would say is the way to optimize your profit and sustain it is to find a niche, to find a particular customer segment whose needs you can meet uniquely well and customize your value chain to meet those needs, and that there's an infinite number of competitive positionings available in any given industry because there's an almost infinite number of customer needs to be met and differentiation. And so while the 5 forces is itself zero-sum, the way around that is through differentiation to create greater opportunities for value for specific customer segments. And that is not at all zero-sum. That is new opportunity. And that's very much where we see the idea of creating shared value.
Great. All right, we're going to bring it to a close there. I would just mention that we close this session, but we then open our second session. And there is most of you, I think, on the call have already registered for that. But for those who haven't, we'll be posting a link here on the chat that you can quickly register and go into that session. That session will start in 10 minutes time. So it just remains for me to thank all of our extraordinary set of panelists. Thank you. I realize we're only just scratching the surface here and starting to find out more about how these different concepts of value creation, complement and stimulate each other. And we certainly need probably more time to go in more depth. And this probably won't be the last of the roundtables that we organize. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for attending. And we'll see many of you, I'm sure, in the next session, which starts at 10 past the hour on the separate link. Thank you all, and wish you well for the rest of your day.